All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 4 for Human Rights class. We are going to discuss about socio-cultural rights with the case study of minority language suppression in China, specifically the Tibetan language. And let me introduce myself. My name is Harzana Nabila. I am with three other of my friends, which is Atia, Hasriana, and Bian. And we will start with the introduction. Hani, you may start. Sorry, Hani, you're still unmute. You're still mute.
Okay. So basically, human rights are the rights that humans have because they are humans. That's just simple as that. Humanity has it not because it is given by society or based on the positive law, but due to its dignity as human being. So human rights provide a common framework of universal recognized values and norms and set out state obligation to act in specific ways to refrain from certain acts. So they are an important tools to hold states and increasingly non-state actors accountable for violations, mobilize collective efforts to develop communities and global framework conducive to economic justice, social well-being, participation, and equality. So human rights are universal, inalienable, interdependent, invisible. Therefore, even though every person is born with a different race, ethnicity, gender, language, and also the culture, even the religion and nationality, he still has the right that must be upheld by anyone or everyone in any country in the world. So this is the nature of human rights. So according to International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that were adopted by United Nations, there are the rights including in the human rights, there is the social and cultural rights. So I'm sorry. There is the rights that calls as social and cultural rights, with the definition that those human rights that are relating to the workplace, social security, family life, participation in cultural life, and access to housing, food, water, healthcare, and education. So those rights include the right to fair wages and equal pay, the right to adequate protection in the event of unemployment, sickness, or the old age, or the rights and to an adequate standard of living. These rights are human rights. So these rights not have a different rights from like how the human rights. They also human rights that contain dual freedom. The first is freedom from the state and also freedom through the state. So however, in the practice, the different categories of human rights have not developed at an equal pace. So compared to another rights, there is a civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. These rights are less developed. So this is partly since economic, social, and cultural rights have been seen for a long time as a secondary rights. So these social cultural rights has been seen for a long time as secondary rights compared to another rights, including the civil and political rights. So the state must guarantee the social cultural rights without discrimination, including race, color, gender, and also the language, religion, politics, or other opinion, national or social origin, property. So the UN committee has identified additional prohibited reasons for discrimination, including disability, age, nationality, marital and family status, sexual orientation, and gender identity, health status, place of residence, and also economic and social situations. So there's called the cultural rights. So the cultural rights also include the rights to participate in cultural life, having individual and collective elements. They can be performed as individuals, in association with others, or in communities or groups. So the state should pay attention to the cultural rights of minority groups and indigenous people, inter alia, and provide opportunities for them to preserve their culture, also the shape of their culture, and also the social development, including their language and land, and also their natural resources. So the cultural rights also complex because that those are including in the cultural rights, and the cultural rights includes in the social, cultural, and economic rights. So these rights guarantees the right to participate and enjoy the benefits of culture and science, and is linked to looking for or search for human knowledge, understanding, and creativity. So these rights of cultural rights are an important part of social harmony, which closely related to the right to people education and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. However, those rights cannot be used as justification for practices that discriminate against other or certain groups, or communities, other human rights. So this concept of human rights was limited. And next, please. Okay, these types of social and cultural rights will be presented by my friend. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hani. So next we will be talking about the types of social cultural rights. And as just mentioned before, social political rights are often correlated with economic rights. With the convention that talks about economic, social, and cultural rights is usually, as mentioned before, also is packed and as is seen as the secondary rights. And just like human rights, social cultural rights also contain dual freedoms, which is freedom from the state and freedom through the state. And today we will start talking about the types of social cultural rights. So first is protection of assistance to the family. This right both applies to the parents and kids. This right covers the rights of family that needs to be provided by the states, which includes maternity and paternity protection, which is basically protection over motherhood, where mothers are pregnant, they must receive protection from being suffered with hunger, and protection from any harm. There's also economic, health, and psychological rights, basically all rights that is crucial to the mother and to the kid. And also this also gives social protection for children, where and also assistance for the family, which includes financial and social support, or for individual children, which is like child services or protecting violence against children, is also a pack of this protection and assistance for families. And also this covers the protection of marriage by consent, because there are a lot of cases about child marriage and unconsensual marriage, because it's from kids getting pressured into marriage. So this rights also covers about that. Any individual that is forced into any marriage will not be recognized by the state. So the next is the right to adequate standard of living. So this right includes the freedom of rights of food, which is to protect the citizens from hunger and food security and malnutrition. So the right to, and also it covers adequate housing, which includes the rights of individuals and both families to not be forced into eviction, and in the eviction is not forced into it by being harassment and other treatments, and the right to adequate space, protection from cold, damp, heat, rain, wind, and structural hazard from any housing that they choose to live in, and disease factors from the house that they pick. So every apartment owner must give all of these rights to all individuals and families who live in their building. The rights also includes the right to clothing and right to natural resources such as water. The next is the right to health. So the right to health is really broad, and it includes all citizens to have the access for health care facilities, goods, and services, where citizens, especially under the country's wage standards, to be provided with healthcare being discounted or fully free. The right to health is also occupational and environmental conditions, which includes safety assurance for life-threatening occupations such as firefighters or something like that, some other profession. The right to protection against pandemic diseases is also one of the rights to health, such as receiving free vaccine or free healthcare from being affected by the pandemic. And lastly, the right relevant to sexual and reproductive health. So next is the right to education. The right to education includes the rights for all children to have the freedom and to have free compulsory primary education, the right to have access to secondary and higher education also for all citizens, and also the right to having free education for kids under the social services where their family cannot provide for them, and also for orphans, and for kids whose parents' income is under the country's wage standard. And the right to education also includes the liberty of parents to be able to choose schools for their children. And the one that we will focus on in the study case later is the cultural rights, which the cultural rights covers many rights, and the right also applies to every individual or a community, and the rights of groups of people to be that. The rights, one of them is the rights of groups of people or individual to be able to express their culture and humanity through their ways of life values, worldview, and meaning of life, or meaning of their existence, and their development through their beliefs, language, knowledge, and convictions. Not only to individuals, cultural rights also, so those are for the individuals. So for cultural rights also covers the right of protection of cultural heritage and resources that allow such identification and development process to take place. The types of cultural rights also includes the right to practice in cultural life, which gives rights to individual to have access to participate and enjoy culture, such as has mentioned before. And the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific process and its application of cultural heritage that need scientific preservation or scientific work. the right to protect of the moral material interest from any scientific. So the protection of any cultural heritage to be protected from being sent it into labs and being basically broken off by science. And also the freedom of is indispensable to have scientific research and creative activity, the rights to education, which allows the access to creation of knowledge, values, and cultural heritage. So the rights to education of learning history of any culture, and also learning any history behind each culture. And the rights to cultural identity for all people include the cultural identity also is for migrant workers. So the rights to having cultural identity, one of them is the right to no discrimination over their culture. This right allows everyone to express their cultural identities without being threatened into discrimination. The cultural right that we will focus on later on the case study is the linguistic right. So linguistic right is the right of every individual to choose any language the individual choose to use as a tool of communication, both in private and in public spheres. This right includes the right to speak one's language in legal, administrative, and judicial acts, the right to receive education and in the language that the individual masters, and the right for the media to broadcast in the language that the individual also can understand. For minority groups, this right also applies, protecting and giving minority groups to use their language in public spheres without any fear of discrimination, although they live in a different country with different different language, they still have to have the protection from discrimination from using their own language. So those are the types of social cultural rights. We can move on to the Convention of Social Cultural Rights, which will be given by Bian.
Okay, so the next is the international. I'm going to tell you for about the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is or ICERCR, which is the primary international legal source of economic, social, and cultural rights. This ICICR was adopted by the United Nations on December 16, 1966, and entered into an international treaty on January 3rd, 1976. ICEICR outlines several essential principles in realizing the economic, social and cultural rights, and includes the freedoms, privileges, and rights that individual and communities need to live a life of dignity, such as the right to food, housing, health, education, cultural identity, and many more. In the term of social cultural rights, it is recognized on Article 9 about the right to social security, and then the right to protection of the family, including protection for mothers and children, in the Article 10, the right to educate, standard of living, including the right to food and the right to housing in Article 11. The right of health is in Article 12, and the right to education is in Article 13, as well as the right to participate in cultural life and right to benefits of science and cultural are in Article 15. Um, under the ICSCR,
countries which already ratified this covenant must take as much steps as possible to achieve economic, social, and cultural rights progressively, and states should respect, protect, and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. And also, there is a number of there are numbers of major international human rights instruments which contains provisions relating to economic, social, and cultural rights, such as International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CRD, that was adopted by the United Nations on December 21st, 1965, and entered into the International Treaty on January 4th, 1969, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of racial or ethnic origin in relation to a number of economic, social, and cultural rights. And also convention on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CDAW, that was adopted by the United Nations on December 18th, 1979, and entered into an international treaty on September 3rd, 1981. And this convention affirms a range of economic, uh, um, um, social, and cultural rights to women. And then the next is the violation on social cultural rights. The violation of economic, social, and cultural rights is a phenomenon that indicates the failure of a state on its obligation to ensure that these rights are enjoyed without discrimination, and the loss of a state to respect, protect, and fulfill them. And based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the term of social cultural rights. These are the uh, the form of violation that might happen. The first is contaminated water caused by state-owned waste facilities, which is violating the right to health. And then banning the use of minority or indigenous languages, which is violating the right to participate in cultural life. And then denying access to sexual and reproductive health service, which violating the right to health. And then the perpetuation of pollution and destruction of food sources such as land and water by private and public entities which fail to prohibit, uh, which violating the right to food. And then failure to prevent the phenomenon of hunger in all regions and communities of a country is violating the rights to freedom from hunger. And then the next will be delivered by Adia, please.
Thank you, Bian. Now I will begin to discuss the case study of our presentation. Here, we've decided to choose for our case study minority language suppression in China and focus on the Tibetan language. The countries are made up of numerous ethnicities and racial groups, and this can also mean that there are numerous languages and mother tongues spoken in the country. Next slide, please. This is the case for China as well. In some cases, when a country has multilingual language is multilingual, they will have a national language, and this is used and spoken in their official administration business. It'll be used to teach for their education, and their minority languages are preserved also through social and culture laws, and sometimes also implemented into their education system. Unfortunately, that's not the case for all countries. Some governments actually attempt to suppress the use of minority languages in their regions, and this is through outright banning the minority languages in education and even the use in private. As mentioned by my friend in the beginning, banning the use of minority language counts as a violation of human rights, especially violation of cultural rights, linguistic rights, since it is considered the violating the right to participate in cultural life. The reason why some countries would ban minority languages or suppress the use of minority languages is because some believe that speaking only one language, speaking a language will prevent the learning process or speaking of using another language. And this is actually false according to many scientific researches, because evidence has suggested that people who speak more than one languages are actually able to think faster, perform better, and even have more potential for creative thinking. Here, China, country that is comprised of 56 nationalities, and the Han nation are the dominant nationality. They make up 92% of the entire region, and 55 the other 55 are minority groups, and though they are spread out throughout the entire region, they occupy about half of the territory. Now, the Tibetans, majority of them reside in the TAR, or the Tibet Autonomous Region. And here, it is located in the western area of China. Before focusing on the Tibetan language itself, China's policy in practicing languages claim to have two types, which is ZZQ and Ronghe. ZZQ itself is a word that translates to autonomy, and it gives the right to each nationality group in China to develop their culture and language and implement self-government in their regions. But in reality though, China has a policy that contradicts this, called Ronghe. And though Ronghe itself means to fusion or amalgamation, which is how the government tries to share Chinese culture by promoting the use of all languages and minority group cultures in the region. In actuality, it is only promoting the use of their national language, which is the Mandarin, and it has instead caused the disappearances of many of their minority languages, cultures, and knowledge, including in the process right now, language. Next slide, please. The proof of the Chinese government banning the use of Tibetan language was shared by the Human Rights Watch, the HRW, in the report published in 2019. They claimed that the Chinese government was banning the use of Tibetan language as a language of instruction in Tibetan schools. Technically, China had already been limiting the use of the Tibetan language in their education starting from 1959, when China annexed Tibet, and Tibet became the TAR in China. At the time, nearly all middle schools and high schools had started to require their students to learn Chinese Mandarin. But however, recently it was revealed that the kindergarten and elementary school stage of education were also required to teach in Chinese. And this is due to the Chinese new bilingual education policy. The bilingual education policy was introduced in 2010 for schools in all minority regions. It was to promote competency in both the local and national languages. And though officially, the policy was meant to promote competency in both the local and national language, in reality, it actually limits the rights for minority groups to freely express their cultural identity and values in schools. This poses a great risk to children's development because scientific studies have shown that children are negatively impacted in their early education. When their early education, including kindergarten and elementary years, are not able to use their mother tongue, this limits them to freely express who they are, their identity, and their values in schools. So by the Chinese government banning the use of Tibetan language in elementary and middle schools, it threatens the survival of the Tibetan culture itself. And it also subconsciously indoctrinates the children with political ideologies and ideas that are contrary to the Tibetan community. So these children would have different ideologies and beliefs compared to their parents. Next slide, please. The Chinese government has slowly implement the Chinese bilingual education policy and through 4 strategies. Here, the 4 main strategies can be seen on the slide. The first is that the government would send huge numbers of Chinese teachers to Tibet. So these are teachers who are majority from the Han nationality, and they can only speak and teach in the Chinese Mandarin language. Meanwhile, the second strategy would be Tibetan teachers would be moved out of the Tibetan region and trained in provinces where Chinese is the main language, and they will be trained to educate in the Chinese Mandarin and not in the Tibetan language. Back in the Tibetan schools, the schools are created with mixed classes of both Tibetan and non-Tibetan students, and so the children will be exposed and to other cultures. And though this is good for transfusion and for sharing cultures in their region, the students will have less opportunities to speak in their minority language. And the final strategy is that the governments would close rural schools, and this has slowly been done beginning in the late 2010s, where students are forced to board in to move and board in closest cities, where they will be removed from their communities, removed from their parents, and from their communities who speak Tibetan language. Next slide, please. This has a great impact on the Tibetan, the TAR, and the Tibetan people themselves. The HRW claim that the actions of the Chinese government are a violation to international law, as it goes against the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which China themselves ratified almost 30 years ago. Now, this convention says that a child belonging to a minority shall not be denied their right to use his or her own language. And the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination recognized from the HRW report in 2019 that the Tibetan language teaching in schools in the TAR has not been placed on equal footing in law, policy, and practice with Chinese, and it has been significantly restricted. Data has shown that 81,000 children in Tibetan region, which is in preschools and kindergartens in the TAR, are receiving bilingual education, and they have attempted to resist Chinese strategies, but they are forced to abandon their culture and traditions. Their protests are usually met with consequences such as arrests, torture, and even prison sentences from the government. And some regions have gone as far to trying to allow their kids to learn in after school activities, special schools such as monks and religious schools. But even that was made into a crisis, into a protest when several after schools and monasteries were arrested, were closed, and the children were banned from learning Tibetan languages. The monks were even banned from teaching Tibetan languages. And as mentioned by in our presentation by my friends above, that this is once again a violation to the human rights of linguistics and human rights of culture. Next slide, please. And now the conclusion will be shared and presented by my friend Icha.
Okay, thank you, Atia. So for the conclusion, as is mentioned before, according to the International Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICESCR, and the International Convention of Civil and Political security, family life, participation on cultural life, and access to housing, food, water, healthcare, and education. These rights are like human rights, and just like human rights, they contain dual freedom, which is freedom from state and through state. Types of social-cultural rights includes protection and assistance to the family, the right to adequate standard of living, the right to health, the right to education, and the cultural right that has its own category of files of rights also, that describes many rights of evolving individuals, communities, and cultural heritage and protection upon them. The social cultural rights under the same in discussion in economic and social cultural rights have been highlighted in some international convention and was adopted by the UN in December 16, 1966 as an International Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and entered into an international treaty on January 3rd, 1976, along with the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And it is also mentioned under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, another convention that talks about social cultural rights is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW, as we know, that also talks about some of the social and cultural rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights are often violated, and some of the examples of violation are contaminated water that's caused by state-owned facilities, banning the use of minority or indigenous languages, the perpetuation of pollution and the destruction of food sources such as land and water by private and public entities which failed to prohibit, denying access to sexual and reproductive health services, which is usually denied by cases of woman rape cases, which is really awful to hear, and failure to prevent phenomenon of hunger in all regions and communities of country. For the study case in this paper, we talk about the minority language suppression in China, specifically the recent proposal of banning the Tibetan language. China claimed to practice the policy known as the ZCQ, I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong, a word that translates into autonomy, where this policy gives each nationality group in China to develop their cultural language and to implement self-government and to determine the use of natural resources and source of development. But in reality, another policy by China contradicts the other policy that they have called wrong. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong again. Scholars claim it is the policy that prevents multiculturalism, which explains China's action on language suppression for the Tibetan language. In 2019, the Human Rights Watch released a report that Chinese government was starting to ban the use of Tibetan language, starting in Tibetan school, and as mentioned before, it developed into the use of the language even in private settings. The HRW claimed that China's action are a violation to international law as it goes against the Convention on the Rights of Child, which China ratified almost 30 years ago, saying a child belong to any minority group shall not be denied the right to use their own language. Another international organization in China international organization has also criticized China's suppression on the Tibetan language, among other languages that they also suppressed. So that is all from our group. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.